Austrian steel corporations. The surgeon of our battalion was the head of a great medical institution and a man of international fame. Among my men in the platoon were a painter, 2 college professors, a singer of repute, a banker, and a post office official of high rank. But nobody cared, and in fact I myself did not know until much later what distinguished men were in my platoon. A great cloak of brotherhood seemed to have enveloped everybody and everything, even differences in military rank not being so obvious at this time, for the officers made friends of their men and, in turn, were worshipped by them. My wife volunteered her services as Red Cross nurse, insisting upon being sent to the front in order to be as near me as could be. But it developed later that no nurse was allowed to go farther than the large troop hospitals far in the rear of the actual operations. Upon my urgent appeal, she desisted and remained in Vienna after I had left, nursing in the barracks, which are now used for hospital work. In fact, almost every 3rd or 4th house, both private and public, as well as schools, were given to the use of the government and converted into Red Cross stations. The happy days in Leoben came to an abrupt end, my regiment receiving orders to start immediately for the front. We proceeded to Graz, where we joined the other 3 battalions and were entrained for an unknown destination. We traveled via Budapest to Galicia and left the train at Strij, a very important railroad center south of Lemberg. It must be understood that the only reports reaching us from the fighting line at the time were to the effect that the Russians had been driven back from our border and that the Austrian armies actually stood on the enemy's soil. Strij being hundreds of miles away from the Russian frontier, we could not but surmise that we were going to be stationed there some time for the purpose of training and maneuvering. This belief was strengthened by the fact that our regiment belonged to the Landstrom, or second line of reserves, originally intended for home service. We were, however, alarmed that very same night and marched out of Strij for a distance of about 20 miles in conjunction with the entire 3rd Army Corps. After a short pause for the purpose of eating and feeding the horses, we marched another 22 miles. The first day's march constituted a very strong test of endurance in consequence of our comparative softness and lack of training, especially as, in addition to his heavy rifle, bayonet, ammunition, and spade, each soldier was burdened with a knapsack containing emergency provisions in the form of tinned meats, coffee extract, sugar, salt, rice, and biscuits, together with various tin cooking and eating utensils. Furthermore, a second pair of shoes, extra blouse, changes of underwear, etc. On top of this heavy pack, a winter overcoat and part of a tent were strapped, the entire weight of the equipment being in the neighborhood of 50 pounds. The day wore on. Signs of fatigue soon manifested themselves, more and more strongly, and slowly the men dropped out one by one from sheer exhaustion. No murmur of complaint, however, would be heard. Most of those who fell out of the line, after taking a breathing space for a few minutes, staggered on again. The few that remained behind joined the regiment later on when camp was established. We wondered then at the necessity of such a forced march, being unable to see a reason for it, unless it was to put us in training. Night had fallen when we reached a small monastery in the midst of a forest, where the peaceful surroundings and a monastic life, entirely untouched by the war fever, seemed strange indeed. Camp was established, tents erected, fires were lighted, and coffee made. Soon a life of bustling activity sprang up in the wilderness in the midst of the forest which only a few hours before had been deserted. It made a weird and impressive picture in the wonderful starlight night. These soldiers sitting around the campfires, softly singing in chorus, the fantastic outlines of the monastery half hidden in the woods, the dark figures of the monks moving silently back and forth amongst the shadows of the trees as they brought refreshments to the troops, the red glow of the campfires illuminating the eager and enthusiastic faces of the young officers grouped around the colonel, the snorting and stamping of the horses nearby, an occasional melodic outcry of a sentinel out in the night. All these things merging into an unforgettable scene of great romanticism and beauty. That night I lay for a long while stretched near the smouldering ashes of the campfire, with my cape as a blanket, in a state of lassitude and somnolence, my soul filled with exultation and happiness over the beauty around me. The rest, however, was of very short duration, for at 6 o'clock in the morning we were aroused, camp was broken up, and soon afterwards we started on a forced march of 22 miles without a halt, during which we twice had to wade knee-deep through rivers. By midday, most of the men were so exhausted that they could hardly crawl along. It was remarkable that the comparatively weaker and more refined city-bred people who had done little physical work in their lives, most of them being professional men, withstood hardships better than that of sturdy and, to all appearances, stronger peasants. The only explanation for it being, perhaps, that the city-bred people, in consequence of their better surroundings and by reason of their education, had more will-power and nervous strength than the peasants. At 2:30 we reached a clearing in the midst of a wood, through which a river flowed. Here camp was again established, and a half-hour later all the hardships of the march were once more forgotten in the bustle of camp life. This time we had a full rest until the next morning, at 4 o'clock, when suddenly orders for marching were given. After we had been under way for about 3 hours, we heard far away repeated rumbling, which sounded like distant thunder. Not for a moment did we associate it with cannonading, being, as we supposed, hundreds of miles away from the nearest place where Russians could possibly be. Suddenly a mounted ordnance officer came rushing with a message to our colonel. We came to a halt, and all officers were summoned to the colonel, who, addressing us in his usual quiet, almost businesslike way, said, "Gentlemen, accept my congratulations. I have good news for you. We may meet the enemy today, and I sincerely hope to lead you to the fight before evening." We were thunderstruck at the sudden realization that the Russians had penetrated so deeply into Galicia. The despondency which followed this startling revelation, however, was quickly replaced by the intense excitement of meeting the enemy so soon. We hurried back to our companies, imparting the news to the men, who broke forth into shouts of enthusiasm. All the fatigue, so plainly noticeable only a few minutes before, suddenly vanished as if by magic, and everyone seemed alert, springy, and full of spirit. We energetically resumed the march in the direction of the distant rumbling, which indicated that the artillery of our advance guard had engaged the enemy. My regiment was then part of the main body of a division. A second division advanced on the road parallel to ours, about 1.25 miles to our left. Both columns belonged to the Third Army Corps, and kept up constant communication with each other through mounted dispatch-bearers and motorcycles. The cannonading had meanwhile become perceptibly nearer, and in the midst of the dense forest we again came to a short halt. Orders were given to load rifles, and upon emerging from the woods we fell into open formation, the men marching abreast, the companies at a distance of 300 yards, with the battalions at a distance of about 1,000 yards. We were slowly entering the range of the Russian artillery. About a mile ahead we could see numbers of harmless-looking round clouds, looking like ringlets of smoke from a huge cigar, indicating the places where shrapnel had exploded in mid-air. Our men, not being familiar with the spectacle, took no notice of it, but we officers knew its significance, and I dare say many a heart beat as wildly as mine did. We marched on until the command was given for us to deploy, and soon afterwards the first shrapnel whizzed over our heads. It did no harm, nor did the second and third, but the fourth hit 3 men in the battalion in the rear of us. Our forward movement, however, was not interrupted, and we did not see or hear anything beyond 2 or 3 startled cries. The next shell burst right ahead of us, sending a shower of bullets and steel fragments around. A man about 20 yards to the right of my company, but not of my platoon, leapt into the air with an agonized cry and fell in a heap, mortally wounded. As we were advancing very swiftly, I only saw it as in a dream while running by. Then came in rapid succession 4 or 5 terrific explosions right over our heads, and I felt a sudden gust of cold wind strike my cheek as a big shell fragment came howling through the air, ploughing up the ground viciously as it struck and sending a spray of sand around. We ran on perhaps 1/4 mile, when from the rear came the sharp command, "Down!" and the next second we lay on the ground, panting and exhausted, my heart almost bursting with the exertion. Simultaneously the whizzing of a motor above our heads could be heard, and we knew why the enemy's shrapnel had so suddenly found us. It was a Russian aeroplane which presumably had signaled our approach, together with the range, to the Russian gunners, and now was probably directing their fire and closely watching its effect, for a chain of hills was hiding us from the view of the enemy, who consequently had to fire indirectly. The aircraft hovered above our heads, but we were forbidden to fire at it, the extremely difficult, almost vertical aim promising little success, aside from the danger of our bullets falling back among us. Our reserves in the rear had apparently sighted